Anne Stuart started out life as the daughter of the king's brother, a noble woman, but not expected to get close to the throne of England. But by the end of her lifetime, Anne had become the first monarch of Great Britain as queen, had suffered through the deaths of her 5 surviving children and 12 miscarriages, had overseen a flourishing of culture, science and arts, and became the last monarch of the House of Stuart. Anne was born on the 6th of February 1665 to James, Duke of York, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. She was the 4th child born to the couple and the 2nd daughter, and of the 8 children born to James and Anne, only Lady Anne and her elder sister, Lady Mary, survived to adulthood. James was the younger brother of the king, Charles II, and would himself have a stint as king in later years. Anne didn't get to see much of her parents, however. As was royal tradition, both she and her sister Mary were brought up in a separate household at Richmond, Surrey, and when Anne was just 3 years old, she was sent in 1668 to stay with her grandmother, the Dowager Queen Henrietta Maria, in France. This was because Anne suffered from a condition known as defluxion, excessive watering of the eyes. She was sent to France in order to see eye specialists there and lived with her grandmother until her passing the following year, whereupon Anne then went to live with her aunt, Henrietta Anne, Duchess of Orleans. When she died suddenly in 1670, Anne, still only 5 years old, returned to England. Just 9 months after her return, Anne's mother, the Duchess of York, died in April 1671, shortly after giving birth to her 8th child, most likely from breast cancer. Shortly before she died, Anne's mother had converted to Roman Catholicism. Her father James also converted at some point before 1673, but the exact date is difficult to know as he kept his new religion very quiet. Charles II knew of his brother and sister-in-law's conversion, but he had asked James to keep the matter very secret. As a result, Charles also ordered that his 2 nieces would be brought up as Protestants. Both girls were given a strict education surrounding their faith, and this would continue to have a profound effect on Anne throughout her life. This also had the effect of alienating Anne and Mary somewhat from their Catholic parents, as James often tried to intervene in their religious education, while Charles would go over his head in such matters. Since neither girl was expected to be a queen one day, their education focused very much on the pursuit of a noble woman, almost to the exclusion of all else. Both Anne and Mary were well versed in Anglican views, sewing, music and embroidery, but were given only a basic understanding of history, geography and law. One of Anne's greatest personal accomplishments was her mastery of both speaking and writing French, something likely due at least in part to the years of her childhood spent in France. By 1673, James's conversion to Catholicism had become public, and he had also married again, this time to Mary of Modena, a Catholic princess born in the Italian Duchy of Modena, who was herself only 6 years or so older than Anne. Charles II was still childless at this point, and so James was next in line for the throne, followed by his children. For the time being, that was Anne and Mary, but if their father had a son, they would be pushed behind their new stepbrother. However, the new Duchess of York, despite giving birth to 10 children over the next decade, would have none survive beyond infancy. In 1677, Anne's older sister Mary married their cousin, William, Prince of Orange. He was an especially suitable groom as he was Protestant, so Parliament was also happy. The king also assumed it would raise his brother James's popularity to have a Protestant son-in-law, but sadly it didn't. Anne was now without her elder sister, but she still had her household, headed by her aunt Lady Henrietta Hyde. When the fictitious popish plot came in 1678 fueling anti-Catholic hysteria, Anne's father and stepmother fled to Brussels in March 1679, only returning to Britain in October of that year when events had died down somewhat. By December 1680, Anne was now 15 and still unbetrothed. Her second cousin, George Ludwig of Hanover, visited London for 3 months. Anne was reportedly infatuated with him, and rumours quickly sprang up that there might be a marriage proposal. As a Protestant royal whose German-born family had a good relationship with Britain, George was a good choice on the surface. But he returned to Hanover and no marriage was proposed. The evidence shows that although the Hanoverian court may have had other options, it was Charles II and James who vetoed the idea. Aside from pleasing his Protestant citizens, Charles also had to consider a husband for Anne that would be acceptable to Louis XIV, King of France, who was Catholic but also an ally of Britain at the time. Meanwhile, in 1682, Anne found herself once again the focus of gossip, this time surrounding herself and John Sheffield, Lord Mulgrave. He was 18 years her senior and strongly denied the implication of courting the young Lady Anne, but it was still enough to have him temporarily dismissed from court. Meanwhile, Charles had been thinking hard on his niece's future spouse and had finally settled on Prince George of Denmark, younger brother of King Christian V, a suggestion by his French allies. He ticked all the boxes, as the Danes were also Protestant allies of France, and Louis XIV wanted the two naval powers working together against the Dutch. James also wanted another Protestant prince to come into the family to diminish the power William held in Parliament. The marriage was agreed upon by all parties, and Prince George arrived in London on the 19th of July. He was apparently well grounded in the sciences, had honoured himself in battle against the Swedes, and was very well thought of, if admittedly a little shy. Much of the negotiations were carried out without the knowledge of the Privy Council, in case they opposed the match. Most ordinary people were somewhat ruffled by the match, mostly because it was understood it had been a French decision. George would remain in England, and the new royal couple would be given £20,000 a year as an allowance. Charles also gifted them the cockpit lodgings at Whitehall as their first home together. William of Orange was furious when he found out about the marriage. Partly, he just didn't consider George very interesting and didn't really want him for a brother-in-law. Partly, he was worried about French interference. But mostly, William was put out when he discovered that George, as the son of a king, would go above him in precedence at the English court. However, while many worried about France's part in suggesting Prince George, in later years George would become strongly opposed to France, and would even go so far after Charles II's death to suggest the king should have eased off his friendship with Louis XIV. Over the next few days, George and Anne were allowed to get to know one another better by playing cards together and spending time over dinner and prayers. Those who saw their first meeting varied from praising George's handsomeness and gentle manners to others who stated he was neither good or bad, but a little fat. The last remark was actually from the French ambassador, who perhaps should have been more emphatic in his praise. On the 23rd of July, the pair were able to visit the theatre together, and through these first few days, Anne gained a positive impression of her new husband. It was to prove the beginning of an unshakable bond. The wedding took place on the 28th of July, 1683, at St. James's Palace, a very quiet affair compared to most royal weddings, with only Anne's immediate family present. It was to be a happy marriage, with the pair remarkably well matched in humour and personality, and they, unlike many royal and noble couples of the time, actually found they enjoyed spending time in each other's company. George's liking of a quiet life where possible, and his seeming lack of interest in politics, led many people to write him off as dull and lazy. But Anne would for the rest of their lives defend her husband to anyone of that opinion, always personally keeping faith in his abilities. Now the Princess of Denmark, Anne had to choose a household. While her First Lady of the Bedchamber was thrust upon her, her stiff aunt Countess of Clarendon, Anne was able to choose her Second Lady of the Bedchamber. She quickly decided upon a woman who had become her closest friend, the ambitious and manipulative Sarah Jennings, who had known her for some time as her husband, John Churchill, was Anne's father's Gentleman of the Bedchamber. Anne and Sarah had actually met before in 1670, but Anne would have just been a small child while Sarah was almost a teenager, so their interests were very different. But by 1682, the two young women grew closer, and when in around 1678 Sarah secretly married John Churchill, whose sister Arabella was also a mistress of the Duke of York, it assured Sarah's integration into Anne's inner circle. John and Sarah's marriage in 1678 was a love match for both of them, and they would remain devoted to one another throughout their lives. Letters between Sarah and Anne reveal something of their relationship, but as Sarah later destroyed her side of the correspondence, we can only really go on Anne's. After Sarah's second daughter was born in 1683, Anne accepted an invitation from the Churchills to become the child's godmother, and their daughter in turn was named after her. Not long after, John Churchill encouraged his wife to write to the princess, who asked after her health often. It was obvious that Sarah became a favourite to Anne very quickly, but this wasn't unusual. Sarah was known for her beauty, her face framed by red gold hair, and she was vivacious in social situations. She wasn't well educated, but she had a sharp mind and a cutting wit, which everyone enjoyed, provided they weren't on the end of it. The quiet and relaxed Anne was drawn to the dynamic and sparkling Sarah, and it wasn't long before the two formed a close attachment. The Duke of York had actually been against Lady Churchill serving his daughter as lady-in-waiting, and letters from Anne reveal how upsetting she found this. She wrote repeatedly to Sarah, apologising profusely about her father's refusals until he relented, and how she begged Sarah to forgive her and not cease their friendship. When Anne heard that Sarah was to leave to go to Windsor with her husband, she became more agitated, protesting deeply against the loss of Sarah by her side. It's clear from the start this was not an equal friendship. In fact, later in her memoirs, Sarah would remark how they would often spend hours shut up together, and any absence of herself worked Anne up, even to the jealousy of a lover. The princess used to say she desired to possess Sarah wholly, and could hardly bear that she should ever escape into any other company. Even Anne herself once admitted her constant writing letters to Sarah was compulsive, and that she thought Lady Churchill very kind to read and reply to her dull letters. In fact, Sarah, behind Anne's back, found the letters a complete bore, and would later say they were never interesting, even if they contained entertaining news. Sarah made it clear in her memoirs that from the start, she set out to please and entertain Anne with her charming and extroverted personality, knowing it was all manipulation to place herself as the favourite. Much has been made of the letters and closeness between Sarah and Anne, and it has been suggested that Anne may have been a lesbian, something that became the main focus in the film The Favourite. However, historically speaking, the evidence for this is blurry. In much later years, Sarah would suggest, with the distribution around court of an anonymous poem, that Abigail Massam, Anne's dresser, was in a romantic relationship with the Queen. She also made it clear in her memoirs that her relationship with Anne was purely platonic. But by the time of the poem, Sarah was being pushed aside as favourite in favour of Abigail, and it's entirely possible she hoped the poem would cause Anne to cast Abigail aside in fear of rumours. However, it is telling that this did not happen, and that no one else at court made anything of it either. It was also not unusual for friendships between both men and women in the 17th century to be full of flowery, passionate language that we would now consider to be the terms only used with a lover. Lady Sunderland, another courtier, also wrote not only to Sarah in the same way, but with other noble ladies who were her friends, stating how she longed to embrace them. Male contemporaries would often comment on the higher purity of these relationships, remarking how they were like marriages without carnal lust attached, and were generally approving of them. Does this mean there were no lesbians in 17th century courts? Of course not. There likely were relationships that were able to go under the radar due to this thinking. In Anne's case, however, the likelihood is she wasn't a lesbian. Both Sarah and Anne, along with all other noble or royal women of their day, knew their duties as a wife was to produce as many heirs as possible, and they were clearly sexually active with their husbands as they both went through many pregnancies. But neither had to spend spare time with their husbands, and yet both seemed to want to do just that. Anne especially was devoted to George in a manner that wasn't expected for the era she lived in. And finally, much like the rumours of Elizabeth I being able to become pregnant secretly, Anne would likely not have been able to engage in an affair, lesbian or otherwise, as she would very rarely have been alone. It's not likely that Anne and Sarah would have been alone for long periods of time at all. Anne would have been attended by all her ladies-in-waiting, especially her aunt, the Countess of Clarendon. She would also have had many servants around her to help with dressing, eating, and even going to the toilet. If there had been hints of an affair with anyone at all, the court would have known about it, such as the whispers with Lord Mulgrave. While nothing can ever truly be ruled out in history, the likelihood of Anne having romantic feelings towards other women seems to be quite slim. It's possible Anne had a crush on Sarah. Anne would later say she wanted to hold friendships, unlike the royals before her, who believed a friendship as a king or queen would not work because no one else was equal to them. However, Anne had more to worry about than her friendships, and it wasn't long after her marriage to George that she fell pregnant. Her first child was born on the 12th of May 1684, a stillborn daughter who was buried at Westminster Abbey the following day. It would only be the first of 17 pregnancies Anne would go through, only producing 5 children who were born alive, and only one of those who survived early childhood. The family could not possibly have known that this was only the first of many tragedies to their dynasty, and Anne would soon recover and go on to become pregnant again. But in 1685, another event would change the dynamics of the royal family, as Charles II died on the 6th of February. His death was a sudden shock for his loved ones, as he had appeared healthy until then, and on his deathbed he asked his brother James to look after his mistresses, as well as lamenting how he had treated his wife. The Duke of York now took the throne as James II of England and James VII of Scotland. The cause of concern amongst most of his subjects, including his daughter Anne, was that he was a Catholic. He set about building a magnificent Catholic chapel at Whitehall that would be completed by Christmas 1686. But to everyone's relief, he also seemed to be respectful of the Church of England, publicly stating that all services should continue as they were. At his first Privy Council meeting, James announced that he would stand by the government as it was, and that he understood the Church of England's principles were for monarchy, and he would therefore defend it. However, at the opening of Parliament, for which Anne was present, James made a speech in which he warned the House of Commons not to keep him short of cash and to look after his best interests. It was slightly threatening. A hint of future problems came on the 26th of May, when a committee petitioned James about enforcing the laws against nonconformists, including Catholics. Not surprisingly, James refused, and the committee went away with their tails between their legs. It wasn't long before the princess once again gave birth, on the 2nd of June 1685, to their daughter Mary, named for her sister. The little girl was considered sickly, and Anne would later be certain it was the London air that had damaged her. Despite the £20,000 a year Anne and George had as an allowance, they had an enormous household to run that they had to keep for their appearance and sake of their rank, and they were soon running low on funds. Added to this was Anne's principal lady-in-waiting, Lady Clarendon, who overspent on Anne's wardrobe, and Anne's gambling debts. This may sound like a debt she could easily have ended, but had the princess stopped appearing at the card tables, it would have been a major social faux pas for the royal family. James eventually increased the annual allowance for his daughter and son-in-law by £10,000, but it was still a long way short of what was expected, and many courtiers and commentators were shocked at what they thought of as James not treating his daughter well enough. Anne's father did also gift them an additional £16,000, but the memory of having to repeatedly ask her father for a raise to her allowance would remain with Anne. James had had to deal with a rebellion not long after his reign began of the late Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, and so Parliament was adjourned until the 9th of November 1685. It transpired that the king had grown the army to deal with the rebellion, and he had given commissions to Catholics, something that was illegal under the Test Act of 1673. When Parliament politely reminded James of this, he told them he did not expect such an address from Parliament. In short, he was in charge and would do what he liked. On the 19th of November, after the King's speech was being debated, many peers publicly opposed the King's stance. It wasn't long after this that James began removing those who argued against him, including 2 MPs with administrative posts and a member of his Privy Council. There were also fears he would attempt to convert Anne and cast aside his heir and eldest daughter Mary in her favour. But despite James's enthusiasm for the idea and the fact that the French diplomat Bon Repos found Anne receptive to receiving some theological texts from him, the princess was not to be turned. Despite showing his daughter testimonials written by her mother and the fact that Charles II had secretly converted on his deathbed, James found Anne completely unimpressed. Mary wrote to Anne, fearing the rumours that their father was harassing Anne about conversion, warning her to stay vigilant and steadfast to Protestantism. Anne replied that she would rather beg for her bread than change religion, and was somewhat disappointed that her elder sister thought she was weak enough to be swayed by James. This was the start of another rift within their family, this time between Mary and Anne. On the 12th of May 1686, Anne gave birth to another child, a daughter they named Anne Sophia. The baby hadn't been expected until June, however, which made everyone nervous, but the King and Queen visited and proclaimed the baby perfectly healthy. Anne was less happy about her father's visit, however, when he entered her room with a priest. She immediately burst into tears, and her father sent the priest away, assuring her he was only there as her parent. It seems likely the pressure of everything was exacerbated by having just given birth, but Anne held steady. It just widened the gap between them over religious differences. James didn't slow his attempts to return to the Catholic faith, determined to overturn the papal laws from Elizabeth I's time that heavily punished Catholics, as well as overturn the Test Acts his brother had overseen. This might seem fair, but there was a plan with this. In May 1686, he told the Pope's representative at his court that in 2 years, England would be Catholic once more. He managed to appoint 4 new members to his Privy Council who were Catholic. and once again he further enlarged the army with men loyal to him and his religion. It made many nervous, as what was the king increasing the army for? England was at peace, and King James had no enemies, except for the laws against Catholicism. Many feared he would use force to enact his will. Meanwhile, Sarah Churchill's grip over Anne's household as she took the post of First Lady of the Bedchamber as Anne's aunt retired grew, and her influence over the Princess of Denmark grew as well. It didn't go unnoticed. Contemporaries would comment that there had never been such an obvious favourite at court, and that Anne was led by Lady Churchill in all matters. Some tension was created between the two, however, when Sarah complained about how tiresome and exhausted she was by her duties, to the extent Anne added a third lady of the bedchamber. This was despite Anne being a very accommodating employer, who stated she never expected Sarah to spend time in her company if she wanted to be with her husband, or needed to spend time with her children. However, Sarah was also instrumental in taking care of Anne's daughters while the princess went to Tunbridge Wells to take the waters for her health. Anne Sophia grew ill after a few weeks, and the medical advice given was, despite the baby being only 7 weeks old, that she should be weaned. Anne was uncertain of this advice and asked Sarah for her opinion. Thankfully, Sarah advised against such a practice. By January 1687, Anne was pregnant again by several months, and hopes were high for a boy. Sadly, on the 21st of January, she lost the baby. It was developed enough to be identified as a son. But fate was not done with Anne and George yet. Just a few days later, their eldest daughter, Mary, fell ill with smallpox. She had never been physically strong, and the little toddler died on the 2nd of February, by which time her younger sister, Anne Sophia, had also caught it. Anne Sophia was the more robust of the two girls, and for a while it seemed she might recover. But by the 8th of February, she too was dead. When autopsies were carried out on the tiny bodies, it was also found Mary had been suffering with tuberculosis and wouldn't have lived long anyway. Anne and George were devastated. In one short period of time, they had lost all of their children. Then George also fell ill with smallpox, and it seemed for a while that he would follow the children to the grave. Anne must have been numb with grief, but she nursed her husband without rest, both mourning their children and weeping while she held his hand. Thankfully, George would not die, but would make a full recovery, although his health was forever impaired by beating smallpox. To make matters worse, after George recovered, he went to visit his family in Denmark in March, and Anne asked her father for permission to visit her elder sister Mary. Because advisors around the king thought the two women meeting would only strengthen them in their adherence to the Protestant religion, James refused. Anne was furious, and her correspondence with Mary became more insolent and rebellious against their father and the Catholic faith. Anne went further, openly attending Anglican sermons that preached about the dangers of the encroaching Catholicism. Although she went in secret, her attendance was still noted and was intended to show her enthusiasm and zeal for the Church of England. She then withdrew to Richmond, where George was resting after his illness, which was a real reason, but it also highlighted her self-imposed estrangement from her father's court. Later in April 1688, Anne agreed to a secret meeting with Dykvelt, an ambassador sent from William of Orange. When James dismissed his groom of the stool, the Earl of Scarsdale, for refusing to question local gentlemen on whether they would vote to repeal the Test Act in Parliament, Anne and George chose to keep him on in their household. When James demanded they remove him, Anne did so, but made it clear she was being forced to do so. Anne was proving herself not only a devout Protestant, but a strong woman in her own right, able to make decisions against her father. But as he was also the king, she had to be careful she didn't go so far as to commit treason. On the 22nd of October, Anne had to suffer yet more heartbreak when she lost the baby son she had been carrying, and he was stillborn at 28 weeks. This pregnancy loss must have been all the more devastating as the little one was almost to term, and it was in the shadow of the deaths of Anne and George's 2 young daughters. A modern suggestion for Anne's frequent miscarriages is that she suffered from antiphospholipid syndrome, a condition which increases blood clotting through extra antibodies. This may have prevented the thickened blood from passing through to the placenta and providing Anne's unborn children with the nutrients required for a healthy pregnancy. On the 10th of June 1688, the situation worsened when Mary of Modena, the Queen, gave birth to a son, James Francis. Already there had been doubts over the parentage of the young boy, as so many years had passed without James and Mary having a child. Anne wrote in letters to Mary that she doubted whether their half-brother really was or not, as she had been absent from the birth, and wild rumours abounded. Doubtful Protestants claimed the real baby had been born stillborn, if the baby had existed at all, and the current child had been smuggled inside a bed-warming pan. Worse than this, as a boy, the new prince now superseded his half-sisters in the line to the throne, and his parents were planning on bringing him up as a Catholic. It was obvious which direction the country would now take. However, William of Orange had been watching events keenly, and his wife Mary had been sufficiently disturbed by Anne's letters that he made a decision which was to change the course of the British monarchy and Britain itself. Protestants in Britain, finally having had enough of a Catholic monarch who was intent on undoing their religion, sent word to William of Orange that they would accept him as king if he would help overthrow King James. William decided, with backing from many in England, that he was to invade and help his wife take her rightful inheritance as queen, with himself by her side as king. Everything was set for the glorious revolution, and Anne could not have guessed how this decision would change her own future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.